The sound that woke me up that night wasn't a crash. Not at first. It was that strange kind of silence that comes right before something goes wrong. Then came the impact. A deep metallic boom that rattled my bedroom window hard enough to make a picture frame jump off the wall. I was already out of bed before I was fully awake, pulling on a pair of jeans and heading for the back door while my heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. When I stepped outside, the motion lights flooded the yard and revealed a scene I don't think I'll ever forget. A silver SUV sat twisted in the middle of my backyard, steam rising from the hood, airbags hanging out like deflated balloons. The front end was crushed against something that hadn't been there a month earlier. And behind all that wreckage, completely untouched, sat my daughter's inflatable pool. I remember staring at it and thinking one simple thing. Finally, my name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 43 years old, a civil engineer by trade. And for most of my life, I've been the kind of guy who believes problems can be solved with patience, paperwork, and enough coffee. I wasn't looking for a feud. I wasn't looking for revenge. Honestly, all I wanted that summer was to give my 10-year-old daughter Lily a backyard she could enjoy before middle school swallowed up the last pieces of childhood. We lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Fort Collins, Colorado. At least that's what it looked like from the outside. Neat lawns, matching mailboxes, families walking dogs in the evening. The kind of place real estate agents describe as peaceful. But anybody who's lived in an HOA neighborhood knows peace can be surprisingly fragile when the wrong people get a little authority. Lily and I spent an entire weekend setting up that pool. Nothing fancy, just one of those large inflatable models from a warehouse store. We measured the yard, leveled the ground, filled it with water, and by Sunday afternoon, she was floating around with a giant pink flamingo, grinning like she'd just inherited a private island. I can still hear her laughing every time I think about it. For a few weeks, everything was perfect. Kids came over. Parents sat in lawn chairs. Summer felt exactly the way summer should feel. Then one Friday night, everything changed. The next morning, I walked outside and found the side of the pool ripped open. Water had drained across half the yard, and deep tire tracks cut through the grass. At first, I assumed somebody lost control of their vehicle. Maybe a teenager. Maybe somebody who'd had too much to drink. It was annoying, sure, but accidents happen. I replaced the pool, repaired the lawn, and moved on. A week later, it happened again. Same night, same tire marks, same path through my property. That's when I started paying attention. By the third incident, I wasn't dealing with bad luck anymore. I was dealing with a pattern. Every Friday night between 10 and 11, someone drove across my backyard instead of using the road. Every single time, the pool ended up destroyed. Lily tried to act brave about it, but I could see the disappointment building. She'd wake up Saturday morning excited to swim and find another deflated pile of vinyl lying in the grass. One morning, she looked at me and asked, "Dad, does somebody hate our pool?" I laughed because I didn't know what else to do, but that question stayed with me. Because honestly, it felt personal. A few days later, I finally got my answer. I was coming home from work when I saw a silver SUV cutting across an empty lot near the neighborhood entrance. Behind the wheel was a kid in his early 20s. Baseball cap backward, one hand on the steering wheel, the other holding a phone. The vehicle bounced over curbs like traffic laws were merely suggestions. A neighbor standing beside me shook his head and said, "That's Gavin Mercer." Then he lowered his voice. His dad owns half the developments around here. That name came up a lot after that. Gavin Mercer. And his father, Charles Mercer. Charles wasn't just another resident. He was the HOA president, wealthy developer, local businessman, the kind of guy who entered every room like he expected applause, the kind of guy people complained about privately but smiled at publicly. I wish I could tell you I immediately connected the dots. I didn't. Not yet. I still wanted to believe there was some misunderstanding. Then came incident number 4. By then, I'd started taking photographs, documenting tire patterns, saving receipts, and speaking with neighbors. More than one person admitted they'd seen Gavin driving through private yards before. Nobody wanted to file complaints. Nobody wanted trouble. That was the thing about Charles Mercer. People were afraid of him in the way people get afraid of someone who always seems to win. Then came the 5th Friday, the one that changed everything. That evening, Lily had spent nearly 2 hours in the pool with her best friend Sophie. Around 9:30, I called them inside for pizza and a movie. They complained, naturally. 10-year-olds always think one more hour is reasonable. 20 minutes later, I heard tires spinning outside. By the time I reached the window, the SUV had already torn through the yard. The pool exploded under the vehicle's weight. Plastic, water, and lawn debris flew everywhere. I stood frozen in the darkness, staring at the damage, and for the first time I wasn't thinking about money. I wasn't thinking about property. I was thinking about what would have happened if Lily had still been out there. 20 minutes. That's all that separated a destroyed pool from something far worse. And standing there in the dark, looking at the wreckage scattered across my backyard, I realized I was done hoping this problem would fix itself. The next morning I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and spread out every photograph, receipt, and sheriff's report I'd collected over the previous 2 months. Looking at everything together changed the way the situation felt. Individually, each incident looked like an annoying act of vandalism. Together, they looked like a story. 5 Friday nights, 5 destroyed pools, 5 sets of tire tracks crossing the exact same section of property. 5 reminders that somebody believed they could do whatever they wanted and never face consequences. As I stared at the paperwork, Lily walked into the kitchen, still wearing her pajamas. She looked out the window at the ruined pool and quietly asked, "Are we getting another one?" That question hit harder than I expected. Not because of the money, because I realized she was waiting for me to tell her whether our backyard belonged to us anymore. I smiled and told her yes. We would absolutely get another pool. What I didn't tell her was that I was already thinking about something much bigger. That afternoon, I decided it was time to speak directly with Charles Mercer. If there was going to be a solution, I wanted to give him every opportunity to handle it like a reasonable adult. I drove to his house, carrying a folder thick enough to impress an accountant. Charles was standing in his driveway beside a brand-new pickup truck when I arrived. He saw me coming and smiled the way politicians smile when they don't actually want to talk to you. "Ethan," he said, "what can I do for you?" I handed him the folder. "Your son has driven through my backyard 5 times and destroyed my daughter's pool every single time." He glanced at the photographs for maybe 3 seconds before closing the folder. Then he laughed. Actually laughed. "You're serious?" he asked. "I am. Maybe you should move the pool." For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misheard him. "The pool is entirely on my property. Then move it farther from the edge. The problem isn't where my pool is. That's one opinion." His tone never changed. Calm, dismissive, condescending, like he was explaining something obvious to a child. I felt my patience evaporating. "Charles, your son is driving through private property." He shrugged. "Kids make mistakes." 5 times. Another shrug. Maybe he didn't see it. I remember looking directly at him and thinking something important. He knew. He absolutely knew. Not only did he know, but he expected me to accept it. The conversation ended with him smiling and saying, "Good luck proving anything." That sentence stayed with me for weeks. Good luck proving anything. The funny thing about saying that to an engineer is that engineers spend their entire careers proving things. Distances, loads, failures, causes, effects. We don't guess. We measure. So that's exactly what I started doing. The following weekend, I pulled the original property survey from my home records. Every measurement checked out. The pool sat well inside my property line. No HOA violations. No zoning issues. Nothing remotely questionable. Then I began analyzing the tire tracks. Most people saw damaged grass. I saw data, entry angles, compression depth, turning radius, vehicle positioning. The more measurements I collected, the more obvious the truth became. Nobody accidentally drove through my yard. The tracks showed deliberate steering adjustments. The SUV wasn't losing control. It was cutting through my property on purpose as a shortcut. The evidence was so clear that I almost laughed when I finished my calculations. Charles had told me good luck proving it. Meanwhile, his son's tire tracks were practically writing a confession. Around that time, a neighbor named Karen stopped by. Karen had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 20 years and knew everybody's business, whether they wanted her to or not. She looked at the latest destroyed pool and shook her head. You know what your problem is? She asked. I'm guessing you're about to tell me. You've been acting like this is about a pool. She pointed toward the Mercer house. It isn't. She was right. This wasn't about a pool anymore. It wasn't even about property damage. It was about boundaries. The Mercers had spent years teaching people that resistance wasn't worth the effort. They counted on frustration. They counted on exhaustion. They counted on people deciding it was easier to stay quiet. The more I thought about it, the more determined I became. Not angry, determined. There's a difference. Angry people make mistakes. Determined people make plans. That's when I started designing mine. Contrary to what some people later claimed, I wasn't creating a trap. Traps are hidden. Traps are meant to surprise people. What I built was visible, legal, and designed for one purpose: protecting private property. I consulted local regulations. I reviewed setback requirements. I spoke with contractors. I even discussed liability concerns with an attorney before spending a single dollar. Once I was satisfied everything complied with the law, construction began. For reinforced concrete bollards, decorative stone finishes, professional landscaping around the bases. To anyone casually walking by, they looked like expensive garden features, which technically they were. Underneath the decorative surfaces, however, sat thousands of pounds of reinforced concrete anchored deep into the ground. More importantly, they sat directly between my daughter's pool and the route Gavin Mercer kept using. At the same time, I installed a complete camera system. 4 high-resolution cameras covering every angle of the property. Motion detection, night vision, cloud storage, automatic backups. If anything happened again, I wanted every second recorded from multiple perspectives. The entire project cost more than I originally planned, but every time I looked at Lily swimming in her replacement pool, I knew it was worth it. Summer continued. 1 week passed, then another, then 3. No incidents, no tire tracks, no destruction. Part of me wondered whether the problem had finally ended. Maybe Gavin found another shortcut. Maybe somebody warned him. Maybe simple bad luck had finally caught up with his habits. Then came another Friday night. I was sitting in the living room watching a baseball game while Lily slept upstairs. The house was quiet. The neighborhood was quiet. Everything felt normal. Then I heard an engine. At first I ignored it. Cars passed through the neighborhood all the time. A few seconds later the sound grew louder. Much louder. That's when my stomach tightened. Something about the engine note felt familiar. Then came the acceleration. A burst of revving. Tires spinning. The exact sound I'd heard before every previous incident. I stood up immediately. The engine roared closer. For one brief second, I found myself thinking, no way. He wouldn't do it again. Then reality answered that question for me. The impact sounded like a cannon going off behind the house. The entire building shook. A shelf rattled. Somewhere upstairs, Lily screamed my name. I was already moving toward the back door before she finished saying it. The moment I stepped outside, the scene unfolded under the floodlights like something from a movie. The silver SUV had entered my property at full speed. But this time, there was something waiting for it. The center bollard stood exactly where it had been designed to stand. The SUV had wrapped itself around the reinforced concrete column with almost unbelievable force. The front axle was destroyed. The hood folded upward. Steam hissed into the night air. One airbag hung out the driver's window like a surrender flag. And sitting peacefully 20 feet behind the barrier was Lily's pool. Not a scratch on it. I remember standing there in complete silence for several seconds. Not because I felt triumphant. Not because I felt angry. Because after months of frustration, months of being ignored, months of watching somebody repeatedly cross a line they had no right to cross, reality had finally intervened. And deep down, before the police arrived, before the lawyers became involved, before the neighborhood learned the full story, I already knew one thing. Everything was about to change. Everything changed faster than I expected. Within minutes, emergency vehicles filled the street, red and blue lights flashing across fences, garages, and bedroom windows all the way down the block. Neighbors started appearing on porches wearing robes and slippers, trying to figure out what had happened. I stood near the edge of my yard while paramedics checked on Gavin Mercer. He wasn't seriously injured, which honestly relieved me. I never wanted anyone hurt. What I wanted was for the behavior to stop. There's a difference. As officers began documenting the scene, one of them asked whether I had security cameras. I pointed toward the house and said, 4 of them. About an hour later, we were standing in my living room reviewing footage. The video showed everything in crystal clear detail. Gavin's SUV entering the neighborhood, accelerating, leaving the roadway, crossing directly onto my property. The timestamp showed exactly when it happened. The camera angle showed exactly where it happened. There was no mystery left. No confusión. No misunderstanding. Then another officer asked a question that changed the entire direction of the investigation. Do you have footage from previous incidents? I looked at him and said, actually, I do. One by one, we reviewed the recordings. 5 separate events. 5 separate nights. The same vehicle. The same path. The same property damage. The room grew noticeably quieter with every clip. By the time the final video ended, nobody was talking anymore. A few days later, Charles Mercer showed up at my front door. He didn't look nearly as confident as the last time I'd seen him. The smile was gone. The swagger was gone. But the arrogance was still hanging on by a thread. Your decorative barriers are dangerous, he said. You created a hazard. I remember staring at him for a moment before answering. Charles, the bollards didn't move. Your son did. His jaw tightened immediately. We're considering legal action. You should do whatever your attorney recommends. He wasn't expecting that response. People like Charles survive on intimidation. They expect arguments. They expect emotional reactions. Calm confidence makes them uncomfortable because it means fear is no longer part of the conversation. About 2 weeks later, my attorney called with information that surprised even me. During the early stages of discovery, records surfaced showing Gavin had already received multiple citations related to reckless driving before the crash. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to establish a pattern. More importantly, evidence suggested Charles knew about those incidents. Suddenly, the case wasn't just about damaged property. It became a question of responsibility, a question of negligence, a question of whether repeated warnings had been ignored. The legal pressure increased quickly after that. Witness statements came forward. Neighbors who had stayed quiet for years finally started talking. Some described similar experiences. Others described situations where complaints mysteriously disappeared whenever the Mercer family was involved. It was like watching a dam crack open. Once a few people spoke up, everyone else realized they weren't alone. I spent months expecting to feel satisfaction if accountability ever arrived. The truth was more complicated. Mostly I felt tired. Tired from the stress. Tired from the conflict. Tired from constantly wondering what would happen next. That's probably why the settlement meeting felt strangely anticlimactic. After all the arguments, all the threats, all the posturing, the case ended the way many civil disputes do. With signatures, numbers, agreements. The final settlement covered the property damage, legal expenses, installation costs associated with protecting the yard, and additional compensation related to the repeated incidents. By the time everything concluded, the total amount was substantial enough that nobody could pretend the situation had been a harmless prank anymore. Actions had consequences, expensive consequences. But surprisingly, the money wasn't the biggest outcome. The biggest outcome happened inside the neighborhood itself. News travels fast in HOA communities, faster than wildfire sometimes. Once residents learned the full story, pressure began building against Charles. Questions turned into meetings. Meetings turned into votes. And eventually an emergency community session was called. I attended mostly because several neighbors asked me to. I sat near the back and listened while residents voiced concerns that had apparently been building for years. Some talked about favoritism. Some talked about selective rule enforcement. Others talked about intimidation. For the first time since I'd moved into the neighborhood, people weren't whispering. They were speaking openly. When the final vote happened, the result wasn't even close. Charles Mercer lost his position as HOA president that night. Watching it happen felt surreal. Not because I hated him. Honestly, I didn't. I just think power has a way of convincing people they're untouchable. Eventually, reality reminds them otherwise. The following spring, the neighborhood installed additional traffic calming measures near several residential areas. New safety policies were adopted. Community cameras were added at key entrances. Parents felt more comfortable letting kids ride bikes again. Life slowly returned to normal. And that's really all I ever wanted. One afternoon, several months after everything ended, Lily and I were sitting beside her pool, eating popsicles. She looked at the decorative bollards and asked, "Are those things ever going away?" I laughed. "Probably not." "Good," she said. "They kind of look like superheroes." Out of all the things that happened, that's the memory I carry with me the most. Not the crash, not the settlement, not the meetings, just a kid looking at a problem that once scared her and seeing something that made her feel safe. A few weeks later, I donated part of the settlement money to a local children's water safety program. It felt like the right way to close the chapter. The rest of life moved on, because eventually every story becomes a memory, even the crazy ones. Every now and then I still walk into the backyard and glance toward those stone-covered bollards. Most people see landscaping. I see a reminder. Not a reminder that I won. A reminder that boundaries matter. Rules matter. Accountability matters. And sometimes the people who spend years avoiding consequences end up colliding with them at full speed. Now here's the part I'm genuinely curious about. Do you think Charles deserved to lose his position? Or should the entire situation have been handled differently long before it reached that point? And what's the most expensive mistake you've ever seen someone desperately try to blame on somebody else? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one.